By the beginning of 1943, Germany was still fighting on every major front in Europe. Its armies occupied vast territories, stretching from France to deep inside the Soviet Union. On paper, the Reich still appeared powerful, even dominant. Yet beneath that appearance of strength, something fundamental had changed. For the first time since the war began, German leaders were confronting a reality they could not easily reverse. The conflict was no longer trending toward victory. The turning point did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It emerged through accumulation. Losses in men and equipment were mounting at rates that could not be fully replaced. Allied industrial production was accelerating. Strategic initiative was shifting. What had once been a war of rapid expansion was slowly transforming into a war of endurance. And endurance favored Germany's enemies. The disaster at Stalingrad, finalized in February 1943, symbolized this shift more clearly than any other event. An entire German army had been encircled and destroyed. Tens of thousands of experienced soldiers were lost, along with vast quantities of equipment that could not be easily replaced. Beyond the immediate military consequences, Stalingrad shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded German operations since 1939. The psychological impact reverberated through both the military command and the civilian population. But Stalingrad was not an isolated failure. It was part of a broader pattern. In North Africa, Axis forces were being pushed steadily westward. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were facing increasingly effective Allied countermeasures. In the skies over Europe, air superiority was beginning to tilt toward the Allies. Individually, each of these developments posed serious challenges. Together, they suggested something more alarming. The strategic balance was shifting in multiple theaters simultaneously. German leadership attempted to respond with renewed offensives and technological innovation. Plans were made to stabilize the Eastern Front and regain initiative. New weapons were introduced, yet these responses were reactive rather than transformative. They aimed to correct setbacks rather than redefine the trajectory of the war. The underlying structural problem remained. Germany was fighting opponents whose combined economic output and manpower far exceeded its own. By mid-1943, the implications of this imbalance were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Allied production of aircraft, tanks, and ships was reaching levels that Germany could not match even under maximum mobilization. The entry of the United States into full wartime production added a dimension of industrial scale that had no historical precedent. What Germany had once achieved through speed and surprise was now being countered by sustained material superiority. The year 1943 did not immediately end the war, nor did it produce instant collapse. German forces would continue to resist with determination and tactical skill. But from this point forward, the question subtly shifted. It was no longer about how Germany would win. It was about how long Germany could continue fighting under conditions that were steadily deteriorating. This transformation in strategic reality defines 1943 as the year the war ceased to be winnable for Germany, not because of a single defeat, but because multiple fronts began to converge against it at the same time. The cumulative effect of military setbacks, industrial disparity, and growing Allied coordination created a momentum that Germany could not easily reverse. From this moment onward, every German decision would be shaped by a narrowing set of options. Offensive ambitions gave way to defensive calculations. Long-term planning yielded to immediate necessity. The war had entered a new phase, one defined not by expansion, but by containment and survival.
The defeat at Stalingrad was not simply a military disaster. It marked a structural rupture in Germany's Eastern campaign. When the Sixth Army surrendered in February 1943, it represented the first complete destruction of a full German field army. More than 200,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment losses were immense, including artillery, armored vehicles, and transport units that could not be rapidly replaced. But beyond numbers, Stalingrad forced German leadership to confront a new and dangerous reality. The Red Army was no longer collapsing under pressure. It was adapting, reorganizing, and growing stronger. Throughout 1941 and 1942, Germany had relied on speed, encirclement tactics, and concentrated force to overwhelm Soviet formations. These methods had produced dramatic territorial gains. Yet they depended on momentum and on the assumption that the Soviet Union would break under sustained assault. By early 1943, that assumption had failed. Soviet industrial production had relocated east of the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of most German bombers. New tank formations and infantry divisions were entering the field in increasing numbers. The Red Army's command structure had improved significantly, learning from earlier catastrophic losses. In the months following Stalingrad, German forces attempted to stabilize the front line. Defensive positions were reinforced, and plans were drafted to regain initiative through a decisive offensive. That effort materialized in the summer of 1943 at the Battle of Kursk. It would become the largest tank battle in history, and for Germany, another strategic disappointment. Despite initial advances, German armored units failed to achieve breakthrough. Soviet defenses absorbed the assault, and counteroffensives soon followed. Kursk confirmed what Stalingrad had already suggested. Germany could no longer impose decisive outcomes on the Eastern Front. The Red Army possessed depth, reserves, and industrial backing that allowed it to sustain losses while preparing for continued advance. German armored divisions, though tactically effective, were increasingly limited by fuel shortages, spare parts constraints, and diminishing replacement pools. Meanwhile, Soviet operational planning demonstrated growing sophistication. Coordinated artillery barrages, defensive layering, and counteroffensive timing improved dramatically compared to earlier years. German commanders were no longer confronting disorganized resistance. They were facing a military force capable of sustained strategic execution. The consequences extended beyond individual battles. Every kilometer lost on the Eastern Front meant greater strain on logistics and longer supply routes for German forces. Retreat required abandoning equipment that could not be evacuated in time. Rail networks were damaged or captured. Repairing and rebuilding under constant pressure became increasingly difficult. By late 1943, the Eastern Front had transformed from a theater of expansion into a theater of contraction. German units were fighting to delay rather than to conquer. Strategic initiative had passed firmly into Soviet hands. For the first time, it was clear that the Red Army would not only survive the invasion, but eventually push westward. This shift had profound implications. The Eastern Front consumed the majority of German manpower and material. If victory there became unattainable, overall victory in the war became mathematically improbable. Germany no longer had the capacity to defeat the Soviet Union quickly, and prolonged war favored the combined strength of its enemies. Thus, 1943 marked a fundamental transition. On the Eastern Front, Germany ceased fighting for triumph and began fighting to prevent collapse. The difference between those objectives defined the remainder of the war. While the Eastern Front was absorbing the majority of German manpower, another decisive struggle was unfolding far from the battlefields of Russia. The Battle of the Atlantic, long considered one of Germany's most effective campaigns, began to shift dramatically in 1943. For years, German U-boats had threatened Allied supply lines, sinking merchant ships at alarming rates and forcing Britain into a constant defensive posture. Submarine warfare had once been seen as a strategic equalizer, capable of offsetting Germany's industrial disadvantage. But by 1943, that calculation was unraveling. The early success of U-boat operations depended on surprise, limited Allied escort capabilities, and gaps in radar and sonar coverage. German submarines operated in coordinated wolf packs, overwhelming convoys and exploiting weaknesses in defensive coordination. Merchant losses mounted, and the Atlantic became one of the most dangerous theaters of the war. Yet this advantage relied on technological and organizational conditions that would not remain static. By early 1943, Allied countermeasures had improved significantly. Advances in radar detection, high-frequency direction finding, and sonar technology allowed escort vessels to locate submarines more effectively. Aircraft patrols extended further into the Atlantic, closing the so-called air gap where U-boats had once operated with relative freedom. Long-range bombers equipped with improved detection systems transformed previously vulnerable sea lanes into increasingly hostile environments for German submarines. The turning point became starkly visible in the spring of 1943. During what German commanders would later refer to as Black May, U-boat losses reached unsustainable levels. Dozens of submarines were destroyed within a single month. Crews that had once operated with confidence found themselves hunted with increasing precision. The attrition rate began to exceed Germany's capacity to train and deploy replacements. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, was forced to confront the reality that the Atlantic campaign was no longer delivering strategic leverage. Withdrawal from certain operational zones became necessary. Tactics were adjusted, but adjustments could not overcome the growing imbalance. Allied convoy systems had matured into resilient, well-coordinated networks protected by layered defense. The industrial factor once again played a decisive role. Allied shipyards, particularly in the United States, produced merchant vessels at unprecedented rates. Liberty ships were constructed faster than U-boats could sink them. What had once been a battle to strangle supply lines evolved into a demonstration of industrial resilience. Even successful submarine attacks failed to produce strategic disruption. The implications were profound. Secure Atlantic supply lines ensured continuous reinforcement of Britain and enabled preparation for future offensives in Western Europe. Without effective submarine pressure, Germany could not isolate its enemies or limit their material buildup. The Atlantic, once a theater of German initiative, became another front where Germany was reacting rather than dictating. By the end of 1943, it was clear that the Battle of the Atlantic no longer offered a path to strategic reversal. Submarine warfare would continue, but it would not alter the trajectory of the conflict. Like the Eastern Front, the Atlantic campaign had transitioned from opportunity to liability. Germany's capacity to disrupt Allied coordination was diminishing across multiple theaters simultaneously. This convergence of setbacks reinforced a growing realization. The war was slipping beyond Germany's ability to control its direction. On land, at sea, and increasingly in the air, the structural balance was tilting in favor of the Allies. As events unfolded on the Eastern Front and across the Atlantic, another transformation was accelerating above Europe. By 1943, the air war had entered a phase that would permanently alter the strategic landscape. Allied bombing campaigns were no longer limited in scope or frequency. They had become systematic, coordinated, and relentless. What had once been contested airspace increasingly belonged to the Allies. Earlier in the war, German air defenses had proven formidable. The Luftwaffe demonstrated tactical flexibility and technical skill, often achieving local air superiority. But by 1943, the balance was shifting in ways that could not be reversed by isolated victories. Allied aircraft production had surged, particularly in the United States. Long-range bombers such as the B-17 and B-24 operated in expanding formations, escorted by increasingly capable fighter aircraft. The introduction of long-range escort fighters significantly reduced bomber vulnerability. Where German interceptors once inflicted heavy losses on unprotected formations, they now faced coordinated defensive tactics and sustained resistance. The skies over Germany and occupied Europe became arenas of constant engagement, with Allied forces returning repeatedly despite losses. Strategic bombing campaigns targeted industrial centers, transportation networks, and fuel production facilities. The objective was not merely destruction, but degradation of Germany's capacity to sustain prolonged war. Rail junctions were disrupted, factories damaged, and infrastructure strained. Repairs required manpower and materials already in short supply. German responses grew increasingly defensive. Air units were redeployed to protect key regions, reducing flexibility elsewhere. Pilot training programs were shortened to compensate for mounting losses. Fuel scarcity limited flight hours, compounding the erosion of combat readiness. Technological innovations, including advanced fighter designs, offered tactical advantages but could not offset systemic limitations. The psychological dimension of sustained bombing should not be underestimated. Civilian populations experienced repeated air raids, while industrial workers labored under constant threat. Though morale did not collapse outright, the sense of vulnerability expanded. The myth of invulnerability, already shaken by earlier defeats, continued to erode. By late 1943, Allied air operations operated with increasing confidence. Large-scale raids penetrated deeper into German territory. Coordination between air reconnaissance and ground planning improved. The air war was no longer a struggle for temporary advantage. It was an environment in which Germany faced continuous pressure. This development had cascading effects. Without reliable air superiority, Germany could not freely maneuver forces across Europe. Troop movements were observed and targeted. Supply convoys faced aerial threat. Strategic mobility diminished, narrowing operational options. The convergence of Eastern Front setbacks, Atlantic losses, and intensifying air pressure created a compound strain. Each front amplified the difficulties of the others. The loss of air control did not immediately end resistance, but it restricted Germany's capacity to recover from setbacks elsewhere. By the end of 1943, the skies over Europe symbolized a broader reality. Germany was no longer shaping the conditions of the war. It was adapting to pressures imposed by adversaries whose industrial and technological momentum continued to expand. While the Eastern Front consumed German manpower and the Atlantic slipped beyond effective submarine control, another theater was collapsing in 1943, North Africa. For years, Axis forces had fought to secure control of the Mediterranean, seeking to protect supply routes and threaten British positions. Under the command of Erwin Rommel, German and Italian forces initially achieved tactical successes that bolstered morale and reinforced the perception of operational superiority. Yet by 1943, the situation had reversed. The campaign in North Africa had always been constrained by logistics. Supply lines stretched across the Mediterranean, vulnerable to Allied naval and air interception. As Allied control of sea and air routes strengthened, the ability to deliver fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements deteriorated. Axis units frequently operated with limited resources, forced to ration fuel and delay maneuvers. The Allied landings in North Africa in late 1942, followed by sustained offensives in early 1943, placed Axis forces in an increasingly untenable position. Coordinated pressure from east and west compressed German and Italian units into shrinking defensive pockets. Despite determined resistance, the structural imbalance in supply and reinforcement capacity proved decisive. By May 1943, more than 200,000 Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia. The loss was comparable in scale to Stalingrad, though less dramatic in public perception. Entire formations were removed from the conflict. Equipment that could not be evacuated was abandoned. The Mediterranean theater, once a zone of German maneuver, became another front where initiative had been lost. The strategic implications extended beyond Africa itself. With Axis forces expelled from the continent, the Mediterranean opened more securely to Allied shipping. Preparations for the invasion of Sicily accelerated. Southern Europe, previously shielded by North African positioning, now faced direct threat. The war's geography shifted. German leadership now confronted a stark pattern. In the east, territory was being lost. In the Atlantic, submarine pressure was failing. In North Africa, forces had been eliminated entirely. Each theater told the same story. Germany's capacity to sustain multi-front warfare was eroding. The collapse in North Africa did not independently determine the war's outcome, but it contributed to the accumulation of irreversible setbacks that defined 1943. The removal of Axis forces from the region narrowed strategic options and exposed vulnerabilities that would soon be exploited elsewhere. For the first time, the Mediterranean ceased to be a contested arena of maneuver and became a gateway for Allied expansion into Europe. The perimeter was shrinking, and with every contraction, Germany's room to maneuver diminished. While battlefield developments were dramatic and visible, the most decisive shift of 1943 was unfolding far from the front lines, inside factories, shipyards, and industrial complexes. The war had become a contest not only of strategy and bravery, but of production capacity. And in that arena, Germany faced an opponent it could not match. By 1943, American industry had fully mobilized for total war. Factories that once produced automobiles were manufacturing tanks and aircraft. Shipyards operated continuously, assembling cargo vessels and warships at unprecedented speed. Production lines were standardized, optimized, and expanded. The scale was unlike anything previously seen in modern warfare. German industry, though efficient in many respects, operated under severe constraints. Resource access was limited. Strategic bombing disrupted transportation and manufacturing. Labor shortages intensified as more men were sent to the front. Even with efforts to increase output, German production could not keep pace with Allied expansion. Aircraft manufacturing provides a clear example. While Germany continued to produce capable fighter designs, the United States was generating bombers and escorts in overwhelming quantities. Losses that would have crippled one side were absorbed by the other. Numbers began to dictate outcomes in ways that tactical excellence could not fully offset. The same pattern appeared in armored vehicle production. German tanks were often technologically sophisticated, but complex manufacturing processes slowed output and complicated maintenance. Allied vehicles, while sometimes less advanced individually, were produced in far greater numbers and with greater logistical simplicity. In prolonged warfare, simplicity and volume proved decisive. Industrial disparity also influenced training and replacement cycles. The Allies could rotate units, repair equipment, and replenish losses with greater consistency. Germany increasingly relied on conserving resources and reallocating diminishing reserves. Each loss carried heavier consequences. Transportation infrastructure became another critical factor. American and British industrial networks were geographically secure from direct land invasion. German infrastructure, by contrast, faced repeated air raids. Rail systems were disrupted, fuel depots were destroyed. Even when production targets were met, distribution to frontline units became increasingly unreliable. By mid-1943, the industrial war was no longer competitive. It was asymmetrical. Germany fought with technical skill and tactical competence, but against a coalition whose manufacturing base spanned continents. The cumulative output of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union created a structural imbalance that could not be corrected through battlefield victories alone. This imbalance translated into time. The longer the war continued, the stronger the Allied position became. Germany's strategy had originally depended on swift campaigns and rapid collapse of opponents. A prolonged industrial war favored the side with deeper reserves and greater production elasticity. Thus, 1943 did not merely represent tactical setbacks. It represented the year when industrial mathematics began to dominate strategic possibility. Even if Germany achieved localized successes, the broader equation was shifting beyond recovery. When war becomes a matter of sustained output rather than decisive maneuver, the side with superior industrial endurance gains irreversible advantage. And by 1943, that endurance belonged to Germany's enemies. While industrial imbalance was shaping the long-term trajectory of the war, events in southern Europe introduced an immediate strategic complication for Germany. In July 1943, Allied forces launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. What followed would fundamentally alter the political and military structure of the Axis alliance. The campaign in Sicily exposed the vulnerability of Italy's defenses. Allied naval dominance and air superiority ensured that German and Italian forces faced overwhelming logistical disadvantages. Although German units executed disciplined withdrawals and defensive actions, the strategic picture was clear. The Mediterranean was no longer secure. The fall of Sicily triggered political upheaval inside Italy itself. Benito Mussolini, whose regime had aligned with Germany since the late 1930s, was removed from power by the Italian Grand Council. Shortly afterward, Italy began negotiating an armistice with the Allies. In September 1943, Italy formally surrendered. For Germany, this was not merely a diplomatic embarrassment, it was a structural shock. An ally had collapsed. Territory once considered secure now required immediate occupation to prevent Allied exploitation. German forces were forced to rapidly disarm Italian units, secure strategic points, and establish defensive lines across the Italian peninsula. This development imposed a new burden on already strained resources. Divisions that might have reinforced the Eastern Front or strengthened Western defenses were redirected south. The war expanded geographically at the very moment Germany needed contraction and consolidation. The Italian campaign itself became a prolonged and costly defensive effort. Allied forces advanced slowly northward, encountering fortified positions and difficult terrain. German defensive lines, such as the Gustav Line, demonstrated tactical effectiveness. Yet effectiveness could not change the strategic reality. Germany was fighting on another front it had not intended to maintain indefinitely. The psychological impact within German leadership circles was significant. The concept of a stable Axis bloc had fractured. Trust in Allied reliability diminished. Military planners now had to account for the possibility of further defections or collapses within occupied territories. Opening the southern front also increased Allied flexibility. Airfields in Italy allowed bombing missions deeper into Central Europe. The Mediterranean became an operational platform rather than a contested barrier. Strategic pressure intensified from yet another direction. By late 1943, Germany faced a multi-front war of expanding scope. The Eastern Front demanded constant reinforcement. The Atlantic required naval defense. The air war strained infrastructure. And now Southern Europe required sustained commitment. The cumulative effect was not immediate collapse, but dilution of strength. Every division deployed to Italy was a division unavailable elsewhere. Every kilometer defended in the south reduced flexibility in the north and east. The invasion of Sicily and the surrender of Italy marked another irreversible shift. Germany was no longer fighting alongside a stable coalition. It was increasingly fighting alone, defending widening perimeters against converging adversaries. By the end of 1943, the problem facing Germany was no longer confined to a single disastrous battle or one failed campaign. It was structural overstretch. The Reich was engaged in simultaneous conflicts across vast geographic distances, each demanding manpower, equipment, fuel, and logistical coordination. No single front could be abandoned without severe consequences. Yet none could be decisively resolved in Germany's favor. On the Eastern Front, hundreds of divisions were locked in continuous combat against a Soviet force that was growing stronger with each passing month. Retreats required defensive preparation, construction of fortifications, and constant redeployment of reserves. Every withdrawal consumed resources and reduced morale. In the Atlantic, naval assets had to protect shrinking operational capabilities while facing increasingly sophisticated Allied detection systems. Submarines that once hunted freely now operated cautiously. Surface fleets remained largely contained, limiting Germany's ability to challenge maritime supply routes. Over Western Europe, air defense networks struggled to intercept bombing formations that appeared with mounting frequency. Anti-aircraft batteries, radar systems, and interceptor squadrons required coordination and supply. Fuel shortages restricted response capability. Industrial regions demanded protection, yet protection was increasingly incomplete. In Italy, newly established defensive lines required reinforcement. Mountainous terrain slowed Allied progress, but also demanded careful positioning of troops and artillery. Maintaining these lines absorbed divisions that could not reinforce other threatened sectors. Beyond active combat zones, occupied territories required garrison forces. Resistance movements intensified in parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Internal security operations diverted additional manpower. These were not headline battles, but they consumed attention and material nonetheless. The cumulative strain of multi-front engagement eroded strategic flexibility. Germany could no longer mass overwhelming force at a chosen point without weakening another sector. Operational planning became reactive. Commanders allocated resources based on immediate crises rather than long-term objectives. Communication and transportation networks were also stretched thin. Rail systems operated under heavy load, moving troops between fronts while simultaneously repairing damage from bombing raids. Fuel distribution required constant prioritization. Decisions about where to allocate limited reserves became increasingly difficult. Strategic overstretch did not mean immediate defeat. German forces remained capable, disciplined, and often tactically effective, but overstretch meant that success in one area could not compensate for deterioration elsewhere. Victory required concentration of force. Survival required dispersion. Germany was forced into the latter. By late 1943, the map of Europe illustrated the challenge clearly. The Reich stood at the center of converging pressures. To the east, Soviet offensives gathered momentum. To the south, Allied forces advanced through Italy. To the west, preparations for future landings accelerated under the protection of growing air superiority. This was not merely a question of numbers. It was a question of strategic geometry. A state fighting on too many axes simultaneously must either achieve rapid resolution or face progressive exhaustion. Germany had failed to achieve rapid resolution. What remained was exhaustion. The consequences of overstretch would not be fully visible until 1944 and 1945, but by the end of 1943, the conditions for that outcome were firmly established. Germany was no longer expanding its influence. It was defending an ever-widening perimeter against enemies whose capacity to coordinate across continents was steadily improving. By late 1943, the question facing German leadership was no longer how to win the war, but how to avoid catastrophic defeat. The cumulative setbacks across multiple theaters had created a structural imbalance that could not be corrected through tactical brilliance alone. Even if individual battles were won, the larger equation remained unchanged. The Eastern Front was no longer a campaign of expansion. It had become a defensive struggle against a Red Army that possessed increasing manpower, improving coordination, and a secure industrial base beyond immediate German reach. Each retreat shortened the front, but strengthened Soviet momentum. Germany no longer dictated tempo. It responded to it. In the Atlantic, submarine warfare had failed to sever Allied supply lines. Merchant shipping losses were absorbed faster than they could be inflicted. Naval dominance gradually shifted in favor of the Allies, ensuring sustained reinforcement of Britain and preparation for operations on the European continent. Air superiority was slipping irreversibly. Allied bombing campaigns continued to disrupt infrastructure, fuel production, and transportation networks. Even when factories achieved output targets, distribution suffered under constant aerial threat. The skies over Europe increasingly favored the Allies, limiting Germany's operational freedom. The Mediterranean had transformed from a contested theater into a staging ground for Allied advancement. With Italy removed as a reliable partner, Germany was forced to defend yet another axis. Strategic depth was shrinking. Industrial production, perhaps the most decisive factor, reinforced these trends. The combined output of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire dwarfed that of Germany and its remaining partners. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, and transport vehicles flowed into Allied formations at rates Germany could not replicate. Replacement cycles favored one side overwhelmingly. War, at its core, is governed by arithmetic as much as by courage. By the end of 1943, the arithmetic was unforgiving. Germany faced adversaries whose aggregate manpower and industrial base exceeded its own by a margin that grew with time. Even flawless defensive performance could only delay, not reverse, this imbalance. This moment represents what historians often describe as the point of no return. Not because defeat occurred instantly, but because the structural conditions for ultimate defeat were locked in place. From this stage forward, Germany's strategy shifted from ambition to endurance. Leadership decisions continued to influence the speed and shape of the war's conclusion. Tactical successes still occurred. New weapons were introduced. German defensive lines held for weeks, sometimes months, but each new position was built farther west than the last. Maps inside command rooms were constantly updated, with red arrows pushing closer toward German territory. Officers gathered around large wooden tables, studying reports that showed shrinking front lines and growing enemy strength. By the end of 1943, Germany still had soldiers in the field, tanks in reserve, and aircraft in the sky. But the balance had changed. Across oceans and continents, Allied factories continued producing ships, planes, and vehicles in overwhelming numbers. Supply convoys crossed the Atlantic without interruption. Rail networks in the Soviet Union moved fresh divisions toward the front. The war did not end in 1943. Battles continued. Cities would still burn, armies would still clash. But the strategic direction had become clear. Each month that passed strengthened Germany's enemies more than it strengthened Germany itself. Inside military headquarters, the realization grew quietly. There would be no decisive breakthrough, no sudden collapse of the Allied coalition. What remained was resistance, delay, and the hope of prolonging the inevitable. For Germany, 1943 was the year the momentum shifted permanently. As 1943 came to an end, the war did not pause. Snow covered the Eastern Front. Factories continued operating through the winter, and military planners on all sides prepared for the campaigns of the following year. Yet beneath the surface of those preparations, the outcome of 1944 was already being shaped by the structural shifts that had taken place. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was no longer merely resisting. It was preparing large-scale offensives designed not to halt Germany, but to dismantle its defensive system entirely. Soviet production of tanks, artillery, and aircraft had reached levels that allowed for sustained, coordinated assaults across wide sectors. Planning now assumed forward momentum rather than desperate containment. In Western Europe, the Allied buildup accelerated under the protection of secure Atlantic supply lines. Troops trained in Britain. Equipment stockpiles expanded. Landing craft were assembled in growing numbers. Air superiority over France intensified. The conditions required for a cross-channel invasion were no longer theoretical. They were material and measurable. Germany, meanwhile, entered 1944 with diminishing strategic options. Defensive fortifications were reinforced along the Atlantic Wall. Panzer divisions were repositioned in anticipation of invasion. Yet these preparations were reactive. They responded to threats rather than shaping them. Fuel shortages continued to undermine mobility. Aircraft production increased on paper, but pilot training lagged behind. Replacement crews arrived with fewer flight hours. Armored units faced maintenance challenges as spare parts became scarce. The capacity to launch large-scale offensive operations was increasingly constrained by logistics rather than by lack of will. Leadership decisions further complicated recovery. Resources were divided between defensive priorities and ambitious weapon programs intended to reverse momentum. Advanced aircraft and missile systems promised breakthroughs, but development cycles could not outpace the industrial strength of Germany's enemies. Innovation without scale could not restore equilibrium. The broader strategic picture had narrowed. Germany could no longer choose where to strike decisively. Instead, it prepared to absorb blows from multiple directions. Planning documents reflected this reality. Emphasis on delay, counterattack, and containment replaced earlier visions of expansion. When observers look at the dramatic landings and breakthroughs of 1944, they often focus on the visible spectacle of armored columns advancing and cities being liberated. Yet those events were the visible expression of decisions and shifts that had already taken place the year before. The collapse of German initiative in 1943 meant that by the time 1944 began, Germany was reacting to an environment it no longer controlled. On the Eastern Front, Soviet command had mastered large-scale coordination. Offensive waves were supported by artillery preparation, logistical staging, and air cover in ways that reflected a mature war machine. German defensive lines, though professionally organized, lacked the reserves required to absorb sustained assaults across multiple sectors. Every breakthrough forced withdrawal. Every withdrawal shortened defensive depth. In Western Europe, Allied planners benefited from uninterrupted maritime transport and air superiority that limited German reconnaissance. Intelligence gathering improved. Deception operations misdirected German expectations. The capacity to concentrate force without immediate detection gave the Allies a decisive operational advantage. Germany still possessed capable officers and battle-hardened divisions. Tactical counterattacks continued to inflict damage, but the strategic framework had hardened against reversal. Industrial disparity widened monthly. Fuel production declined under bombing pressure. Training pipelines struggled to replace combat losses. The war had transformed from a contest of maneuver into a contest of endurance. Endurance favored the side with broader economic foundations and secure supply systems. Germany's earlier campaigns had relied on speed and shock. Now speed was limited by fuel, and shock was blunted by enemy preparation. By the time 1944 operations began in full scale, the strategic imbalance established in 1943 was already determining their trajectory. The decisive battles of the following year were not sudden surprises. They were consequences. Germany entered 1944 still fighting, still resisting, but no longer positioned to shape the outcome on its own terms. The initiative had passed permanently. What followed was the execution of a shift that had already occurred. When historians examine the collapse of great powers, they often look for a single catastrophic event. A battle lost, a city captured, a political decision gone wrong. Yet history rarely turns on one moment alone. More often, it shifts when multiple pressures converge at once, creating a condition from which recovery becomes increasingly unlikely. For Germany, that convergence occurred in 1943. On the Eastern Front, momentum had reversed. Soviet forces were no longer absorbing defeat, they were inflicting it. Operational depth and industrial relocation ensured that each German advance became harder to sustain, and each retreat strengthened Soviet positioning. Across the Atlantic, supply routes remained open. Merchant ships crossed safely in growing numbers. Reinforcements, equipment, and fuel moved steadily towards staging areas for future operations. The attempt to strangle Britain had failed, and with that failure, the possibility of isolating Western resistance diminished permanently. In the skies over Europe, air superiority shifted from contested to increasingly dominant in Allied favor. Bombing campaigns imposed continuous strain on infrastructure and production. Even when output rose, distribution faltered. Air defense consumed resources that could not be spared. In North Africa, an entire Axis presence vanished. In Italy, a former ally became a battlefield. Defensive lines replaced offensive ambitions. Strategic initiative migrated outward, away from Berlin and toward capitals coordinating from across oceans. Industrial production widened the gap further. Tanks, aircraft, artillery pieces, and transport vehicles rolled off assembly lines in volumes that redefined the scale of modern warfare. The longer the conflict endured, the more that imbalance compounded. Strategic overstretch limited flexibility. Germany could no longer mass force without weakening another sector. Every decision required trade-offs. Every reinforcement carried opportunity cost. None of these factors alone guaranteed defeat, but together they reshaped the trajectory of the war. The campaigns of 1944 and 1945 would bring dramatic images: armored columns advancing across France, Soviet forces pushing toward Berlin, cities reduced to rubble. Yet those images were the visible expression of structural conditions already set in motion the year before. By the close of 1943, Germany still fought with discipline and determination. Soldiers held defensive lines. Pilots continued interception missions. Commanders drafted contingency plans. But the framework within which those actions occurred had changed irreversibly. Victory had required rapid collapse of enemies. Instead, Germany faced a coalition whose strength increased with time. Endurance had become the decisive factor, and endurance favored its opponents. Thus, 1943 stands not as the end of the war, but as the year its outcome became increasingly defined. The path to final defeat was not immediate, but it was narrowing. Options diminished. Recovery required conditions that no longer existed. History often remembers the final act, yet the true turning point is sometimes found earlier, in the year when the balance shifts and never fully returns. For Germany in the Second World War, that year was 1943. In the final analysis, wars are not decided only by courage, leadership, or even battlefield brilliance. They are decided by the alignment of resources, coordination, and time. When one side gains the ability to replace losses faster than they are inflicted, to reinforce multiple fronts without weakening another, and to sustain pressure indefinitely, the balance begins to harden. By the end of 1943, that hardening had occurred. Germany still possessed capable divisions, advanced weapon designs, and experienced commanders. But capability without scalability becomes fragile. Each loss demanded replacement. Each replacement required fuel, training, and production. Each of those elements was increasingly under strain. Meanwhile, across continents, factories operated without interruption. Convoys crossed oceans. Rail networks carried reinforcements east and west. Strategic bombing expanded. Coordination between Allied powers deepened. The machinery of coalition warfare functioned with growing efficiency. The conflict did not end quickly. The years that followed would witness intense battles, counter-offensives, and moments of dramatic resistance. Yet those moments unfolded within a framework already shaped by cumulative imbalance. In many ways, 1943 represents the transition from possibility to inevitability. Not inevitability in a dramatic or instantaneous sense, but inevitability in structural terms. The capacity to recover narrowed. The capacity to dominate disappeared. The war transformed from a contest of ambition into a struggle for survival. When examining turning points in history, it is tempting to focus on singular events. A battle, a speech, a breakthrough. But the most decisive shifts are often systemic. They occur when economic strength, military coordination, geographic positioning, and time converge in favor of one side. For Germany, that convergence did not occur in 1945, when Berlin fell. It did not occur in 1944, when multiple fronts collapsed. It occurred in 1943 when the strategic equation tilted and never returned to balance. The war would continue. Lives would still be lost. Cities would still be destroyed. But from that year onward, the trajectory had changed. And in the study of modern warfare, 1943 remains a defining lesson. Momentum, once lost at a structural level, is rarely regained. When we look back at the Second World War, it is easy to focus on the final images. The ruins of Berlin, the surrender documents, the closing battles that marked the formal end of the conflict. But those moments were conclusions, not causes. The real shift happened earlier, when momentum changed in ways that could not be reversed. In 1943, Germany faced a convergence of realities it could not fully overcome. Industrial imbalance widened, air superiority slipped away, naval disruption failed. The Eastern Front turned permanently against it. Strategic overstretch, limited flexibility. Allies coordinated across continents with increasing efficiency. None of these developments alone ended the war. Together, they reshaped its direction. From that point forward, Germany fought not to expand, but to endure. Not to dictate, but to respond. Not to win quickly, but to delay defeat. History remembers 1945 as the year the war ended in Europe. But historians increasingly recognize 1943 as the year the outcome became structurally defined. It stands as a reminder that in modern warfare, momentum is more than battlefield success. It is industrial strength, logistical reach, coordination, and time. And once those elements align decisively against a nation, even the strongest armies struggle to reverse the tide. For Germany in the Second World War, that decisive alignment occurred in 1943.